All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and start on the last bit of this lecture. Okay, so let me start this slowly. All right, so we're going to talk about subcultures, and that's essentially values and norms distinct from those of the majority held by a group within a wider society. So these are all of our littler groups that are still maintained in a bigger culture. So you have American culture, but you have a ton of different subcultures in America, right? And that makes sense. So even if you look at something like gamer community, right, you're going to have this gamer community as this larger culture, but then depending on what games you play, you're going to have little subcultures and little different things that they distinctly value or distinctly how they communicate, right, that change how they communicate. And that's just kind of one example. Subcultures imply different cultural backgrounds and languages, but they also include segments of the population that have different cultural patterns. Some people identify with a particular subculture, whereas others move among several. So we can have multiple different subcultures that we're a part of. And again, some of those subcultures are going to depend on the institutions we're in. It's going to depend on our work-based groups. It's going to depend on our social groups. It's going to depend on our religious groups. All of these different things are going to impact which social cultures, subcultures that we have. Countercultures are cultural groups within a wider society that largely reject the values and norms of the majority. For example, throughout most of the 20th century, gay men and lesbians formed distinct counterculture based on distinct enclaves in major cities and even developed political power bases. And essentially, this is just to say that a lot of these end up being marginalized populations, and what ends up happening in counterculture is that these populations, due to wide amounts of oppression, violence, what have you, have created a way in which to say, no, I'm going to take up space. I'm going to take up space in this way, and I'm going to reject this cultural norm. I'm going to reject this thing that you think about me, or this thing that you think about something that really matters to me. And so that's how you're going to end up with countercultures. So assimilation is the acceptance of a minority group by a majority population in which the new group takes on the values and norms of the dominant culture. Some of this, that makes it sound very flower and rainbow, right? Like, hey, I'm going to join this new group and I'm going to become part of their group. So I'm going to just take on all the things that matter to them and they're going to matter to me. But assimilation is not always that easy, and sometimes it's forced. And so essentially, a good example of this in the US is when the government, along with some religious institutions, decided that in order to have Indigenous persons within our society, their children had to essentially be taken from them and raised in religious schools and or government operated school systems that essentially stripped them from their own cultural understandings, language, and beliefs, and even dress, and all of those cultural norms, and assimilate them very forcefully into white Christian American society. And essentially that process. So my point here is that process can be incredibly harmful, or it can be something like, hey, I am really, really enjoying this particular thing, this particular type of music, maybe. And so I am going to assimilate into a group that essentially are fans of them in order to essentially have that group as my social space. So there are positives and negatives to assimilation. And I just want you to understand that that process does not always look like flowers and rainbows. So rather than the idea of this assimilationist melting pot, there's a more apt metaphor, which is a salad bowl. Essentially, there's going to be different textures. There's going to be different flavors. There are going to be different, everything's going to look different, right? You're not going to have a big vat of gravy, right? You're going to, where everything's kind of mixed and really solid and everything looks very similar. You're going to have something that can look very, very different. So multiculturalism is a condition where ethnic groups exist separately and share equally in economic and political life. It calls for representing cultural diversity and promoting the equality of different cultures. So when you're exposed to a new culture, people may experience culture shock, which is really just like a state of holy crud, what is happening to me? Like, or what this is extremely different than what I'm used to. A lot of people experience some of this when they first go to college and they're first around new and different groups of people that don't have a similar background or even language sometimes. And there's a feeling of disconnect because there's certain cultural elements that don't match up. So then you have ethnocentrism, which is this tendency to look at other cultures through the eyes of one's own cultures and thereby misrepresent them. So you're going to look at everything based on the assumptions you have been taught, based on the boxes you've been taught, based on the languages you've been taught. And you're going to essentially take that view of the world, the bubble that you have grown up in, and you're going to take it and then you're going to try to apply it to a culture that it does not necessarily apply to. And once you've done that, you're going to be like, well, these things may be bad because I don't have a reference point for them, or they eat these really gross foods because I didn't grow up eating them. Not necessarily that the foods are gross, but if there's something that aren't valued to you and your own norms, then you're going to look at that and possibly misrepresent or misinterpret the meaning and or both the understanding of certain things based on the fact that that's just not something that is part of what you understand as tradition or normative. Cultural relativism is the practice of judging a society by its own standards. And so essentially you are trying to let another person talk about their own society, talk about their own values and belief system from the perspective of them. And then you're trying to adapt essentially that understanding of that culture based on that. Now, are you going to be able to 100% get rid of all of your biases? Probably not. And that's because they're ingrained and taught to us, again, from a very, very young age. Cultural universals are values or morals of behavior shared by all human cultures. These include some form of family system, some form of art, some sort of dancing, body adornment, games, gift giving, joking, and rules based on hygiene. So all cultures have all of these things. Now, that does not mean that everyone has the same kind of family systems, but every culture has family systems, right? And so that's kind of what they're talking about, is that there are some general things that almost all human beings have some form of. It just doesn't mean that they're necessarily the same as everyone else's form of those. Two especially important cultural universals, and two things that are going to come up again when we talk about things regularly, is ways of communicating and expressing meaning. So you're getting back at language, you're getting back at symbols, right? Those things are important. And dependence on material objects in daily life. So we need our resources. And what we consider necessary varies widely by culture. Marriage is also a cultural universal, though the details of it vary very, very much between different cultures. And marriage is just a socially approved sexual relationship between two individuals. And so that's, again, going to have a lot of distinct and varying understandings, but that concept that there is people that can be joined socially and form specific kinds of intimate bonds, and who can do that with whom in what ways is something that then ends up getting varied. Cultural traits are closely related to overall patterns of development in society. The level of material culture reached in a society influences cultural development. So essentially what this is just talking about is without certain technologies, without certain kind of resources, you can't have certain aspects. So like you can't have an education system built on computer-based things if that technology does not exist in your area and or if you don't have access to it. So an example of development in technology is that today is, especially in America, cars are a very big part of our cultural understanding. However, if you go into multiple other different cultures, public transportation like trains or public transportations like buses, those things are going to be more part of their things a part of their culture, or even horseback riding, or even forms of travel like camels, things of that nature. Depending on where you are in the world, what kind of thing you travel on is going to depend on largely on your culture. But again, then we get into Wi-Fi, running water, electricity, plumbing. All of these things are technological innovations that have been made in recent human history that have drastically changed cultural understandings and have varied culture. So the earliest societies essentially were hunters and gatherers. Most of their resources were acquired by them for them. And they used part of those, and they used part of their group, part of their time in the day to acquire the things they needed, like food, water, things to provide shelter, those kinds of things. A large portion of hunter-gatherers were nomadic and followed the resources, because the resources, depending on the time of year, would dramatically change due to the environment. It just kind of depended on what environment you lived in. There are small groups of tribes. They often numbered in about 30 to 40 people, and they survived based on hunting, fishing, and gathering edible plants. They continued to exist in parts of the world, so depending on where they are and how closely they were to interacting with other kinds of individuals, determined whether or not essentially they're still around. Most hunter-gatherer societies, or most societies of this nature, have been destroyed or absorbed into some kind of Western culture, into some kind of colonialistic branch of some kind of bigger society. And that comes with good, bad. And it comes with maybe more resources to them, but it also comes with generally some kind of assimilation and or some kind of mass trauma to the culture. Then you have pastoral societies, and these are ones that essentially domesticate animals or domesticate some kind of like they end up, their entire society is based on essentially the production, maintaining, and then essentially selling of particular kind of animals. And they don't always sell it. Sometimes they barter with it. Sometimes they keep it for substance. Yeah. Anyway, and then we have agrarian societies, which are just based on essentially the same kind of thing, except it's crop production. So they're going to have specific kinds of crops that are there to substantiate their lifestyle and to either sell, barter, trade, or consume themselves. Sorry, it's a lot of talking. From about 6,000 BCE onward, we find evidence of societies larger than anything that existed before. That number is actually probably a little earlier due to recent scientific discoveries. However, really, we saw a lot more pop up around this time. Such societies are called civilizations, and they are characterized by the development of cities, pronounced inequalities of wealth and power, ruled by kings and emperors, use of writing, and flourishing of arts and science. So essentially, this is when we start getting institutions, right? This is when we start getting into the institutions of formal governing, hierarchical structures of individual groups. You see some kind of ruling or leadership. You see language, writing, symbols, that and you see this amount of people that are part of these different like cultures being much, much greater than, say, in your hunter-gatherers or in your agrarian or pastoral societies. And most of those, and that's mostly because there is institutions in which a larger group of people can have more things that they need. Unfortunately, there's also limited resources, so there's ways in which they maintain specific things of that nature. So the most traditional pre-modern societies were empires. So think Aztecs, think Egypt, think ancient Greece, think thinking the Mayan cultures, things of that nature. Industrialization, which is the process of machine production of goods, really changed how our economic structure worked and changed how humans started to govern themselves. Essentially, it started in the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution in Britain, which affected people's means by gaining a livelihood through the invention of new machines, harnessing the power of resources for production, and the use of science to improve production methods. So essentially, we started being able to mass produce in ways that impacted who could get resources, how they got them, and who had control over them. Industrial societies are strongly developed nation states in which the majority of the population works in factories or other are offices rather than agricultural. So essentially, this is when, while people might be helping with one specific kind of resource, they do not and cannot sustain themselves without the systems put in place. And so these societies are really focused on being able to do something, have a symbol that represents that you did something, and that symbol allows you access to resources. And that varies. So say in this society, that would be money, right? So money put in place, and you get paid for the labor that you do, and then that labor does not result necessarily in specific things like water or crops or the things that you're making even, but what it does transfer over into is this symbolic piece of paper that then can go and acquire resources like food, water, shelter with it. Industrial societies were the first nation states to become in existence. A nation state is a particular type of states. And when they say states, they're not talking about like Kentucky or Oklahoma. They're talking about a particular governing body. So a nation state is something like the US or France or Turkey, or I don't even know, I'm pulling random countries out of them. But essentially, it's a characteristic of a government that has sovereign power that's defined by the area in which it operates and the populations who are in there. So when, say, when somebody wants to, or when, especially like within the UN, a new nation state is formed when a particular group defines territory that is their own outside of a bigger, outside of another nation state, and forms their own symbols, cultural identity, and what have you. And then it is recognized by other nation states. That's very important, because if it's not recognized by other nation states, including the one that they had previously been a part of, if their independence is not recognized, then they are not considered a nation state. So even though we are a nation state and we have an understanding that all the indigenous groups within this nation state have some level of autonomy, that autonomy is not granted in its own nation state. And so they do not have control of their own defined area, and so they don't get a say in the same way on an international level or even within the nation state of the US to change how they are governed, how the processes work for them. Colonialization is the process by whereby Western nations especially establish their rules in parts of the world away from their home territories. So when you look at any kind of African countries that speak French, that speak some of them speak Spanish, but that's rare anymore, that speak English. All of those things came out of a process of colonialization, and when European countries essentially went and decided they were going to expand their territories into places where other people lived. The problem here becomes that also came with genocide, that also came with cultural destruction, that also came with the loss of massive amounts of cultural diversity and just global societies as a whole. And societies are shaped by such settler colonialism, rapidly expanded in rapidly industrialized and made up wealthier countries known as the global north today. So essentially all your big names, that continue to govern things or rule things, and things like the United Nations, or even created the United Nations, came out of this acquiring by force and extreme harm other lands. So the United States in and of itself is colonialization, because there were already people here, already cultures here, already identities here when settlers came over and decided that they were going to become part of that land. And once that kept expanding and kept engaging in tactics of threats, harm, and what have you, in order to acquire that land or claim that land, that became a colonialization project. Other regions of Asia, Africa, and South America saw a form of colonialization where local populations remained in the majority, but were still governed by colonial powers. These they industrialized more slowly and make up the developing world today. And the developing world is a less developed societies. They're developed differently. Their morals and traditions are recognized as something that don't necessarily have the same, they don't ascribe the same meanings to some of the similar things as the global north. That doesn't make them a less than society. I want to emphasize this. It means that in the capitalist process, they are not hierarchically in the same structure as some of the global north. So as long as capitalism maintains as the global economy, these developing societies, or these less developed societies, into that process become hierarchically ranked lower than those that are higher up in that. And that really just comes down to globally, we have this particular economic strategy, and that strategy is benefiting some and not others. And it makes it very hard for nation states that weren't the original colonialization forces to become higher on that capitalist project, higher within that. Hold on. The developing world is also referred to as the Global South. Many countries in the Global South have become independent states only since World War II. That's also not accurate. They were recognized by the Global North in these independent states after World War II. You have to remember that all of these cultures that were there prior to colonialization were their own entities, were their own independent entities. The difference is that they weren't necessarily recognized by those who wanted the resources that their land offered. And so as long as they could take their resources and take that land, then they didn't have to acknowledge the independent cultural groups that claimed that land first. So as long and so really what they're talking about here after World War II comes down to the lack of acknowledgement of indigenous populations all over the globe that consistently were brutalized and wiped from the face of existence. Emerging economies are developing countries such as India or Singapore that over the past 2 or 3 decades have began to develop a very strong industrial base. So these are some of the less colonialized groups, or some of the groups that were colonialized in certain ways, that have succeeded fairly well in the global market, and that has given them a level of autonomy that they are looked at in a different way than some of the other developing countries, our nation states. How does globalization impact all of this? So it's increasingly impossible for cultures to exist as islands, or essentially completely isolated from other groups, due to the fact that there's so much media interconnectedness through communication, through proximity, through ability to travel. And so really there becomes this force of global culture, which includes things like television or technology of that kind, the emergence of global economy, which really was just capitalism taking over everything. The idea that there's these global citizens or people who um, really are working and or existing on a plane that involves multiple countries regularly, and that we all, because we are so connected, need to look at the global society as a culture in and of itself, because there is language and communication via technology that is allowing space for that. And then it ends up being having a host of international organizations and governing entities such as the United Nations. Now, that doesn't mean they have the same power or control as the nation states, and that's something to be aware of. And again, allowing electronic communications across the globe really impacted their ability to be something that looked more unified. Really, the world has become a single social system as a result of growing interdependence, both economically and socially, and that virtually now affects everyone globally. That does not mean that it affects everybody in the same ways. There's a multitude of variants depending on hierarchically where you are in that economic system and or where you are in that social system and where your nation state is in both the economic and social system. It means that our lives are increasingly and quickly influenced by the events happening far away from our everyday activities. Does the internet promote a global culture? Many believe that the rapid worldwide growth of the internet corresponds to the spread of values that echo European and North American cultures. And that's really important because that's not necessarily making a global culture, that's making a different form of colonialization, right? So when your information is prioritized, your language is prioritized, your symbols are prioritized in a way that spreads to other areas and takes over some of their language, symbols, and what have you, that ends up becoming less about coexistence and more about assimilation again. Countries reinforce traditional cultural values by censoring and blocking opposing content. So you see this a lot in China, you see this a lot in Russia, you see this a lot in some of those other North Korea, some of those other more closed off nation states. But you also see it to an extent in some of the more progressive nation states as well, in a way that they don't want necessarily to see some of the negative outcomes that their country may have. And that's something that the US does. We don't like to talk about the things that we have done that destabilize other countries, but we generally focus on this America first, America's great kind of messaging that doesn't always hold up when you look at the impact we have globally. The growing global cultures provoked numerous reactions on a local level. So you see a lot of nationalism, which is just this set of beliefs that express and identify, are expressing this identification with a national community. It can be highly political, and it includes or involves attempts to assert power of a nation based on a shared ethnic or racial identity over people of another racial and ethnic identity. And so you do see a lot of that in the United States, as people and as diversity continues to flourish and continues to be part of this particular nation state. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave you for this chapter. I hope that all of you are enjoying this material. The culture really gets down to the why we do things as opposed to the how they're done. So we're going to focus a lot on how things are done, and how institutions are formed and things of that nature as we move through the course. But this really gives you an idea of how and why those things happen. And they happen because people value a particular thing within their culture. And so they make and wrap institutions and ideas around those. But as always, please feel free to reach out if you need anything. And I hope you have a wonderful week.